Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Hungarian Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome to the Hungary Race Ratings, the series taking a more chilled out look at the driver performances. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend. Also, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy it and subscribe down below for more F1 content every week. Now, with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. So results-wise, it's back-to-back wins for Max Verstappen, this time having started 10th on the grid. In behind, Lewis Hamilton up from 7th, George Russell in 3rd as Mercedes have back-to-back double podiums, Sainz leading the Ferraris in 4th ahead of Perez and then Leclerc in 6th, another disappointing day for Ferrari. And then best of the rest, Lando Norris ahead of both Alpines with Sebastian Vettel picking up the final point in his final Hungarian Grand Prix. Now, onto the race itself, and while the top four held their places at the start, in behind it was good ones for Hamilton, Verstappen and Perez, all up some places, which was key to bring them into the fight early on. Russell held off the Ferraris for a while, but then on the second stint Leclerc took the lead. In behind you had Verstappen just undercutting everyone, undercutting his way past Hamilton, Sainz and Russell, before he then caught and passed Leclerc. Had to do it again because he had a little 360 in there as well. And while all of that happened, we had Sainz and more notably Hamilton on the quick soft tyres at the end, with Lewis making the better use of those to get past Sainz and then Russell. And poor Leclerc put onto the hard tyres, why oh why, had to stop again and Ferrari sentenced him from what should have been a win to 6th place. Onto the ratings then, and you guys have given it a 7.2, which I think for Hungary, which can sometimes be a little bit dull, I'd say that's a good one. For me though, I'm trying to decide between a 6.5 and a 7. But I think I'm going to go with the 7, as there was a good amount of strategy in there, a good number of overtakes and drivers to watch making progress. But I definitely think it just lacked a little bit of tension, maybe a little bit of drama. You know, Ferrari kind of took themselves out of it and the Mercedes didn't quite have enough to properly challenge Verstappen. But on the whole, definitely enjoyed it. Definitely a consistent 7 across the race as well, I think, rather than having some significant highs or low points. On to teams then, and I'll start with Williams, and not gonna lie, a pretty poor one even by their standards for this season. Driver-wise, starting with Albon, who kind of wrecked it for himself a little bit on lap 1. There weren't any penalties, but did have contact with Stroll, I believe, and the damage forced him to pit, and from there, any hope of points were gone. Also at the back, and then eventually caught up and passed Latifi through pit stops, but it did take him the whole race. I think rating-wise, it's got to be pretty low. I think probably a 4. Lap 1 instant and the pace afterwards wasn't amazing, just about average really. Then Nicholas Latifi, a pretty poor race, running net last most of the time other than when Tsunoda spun and then Bottas not finishing. And compared to Albon, who had a very compromised 3-stop strategy, versus Latifi, who had a pretty regular 3-stop strategy, it didn't look good for him to still be sort of 16 seconds off of Albon by the end of it. So it's pretty poor pace-wise. Did keep it clean though, so probably a 3.5 for him, just not running anywhere near the level he should be at by now. Next up Haas, and not quite as good of a car as they'd maybe have hoped for, and a fairly disappointing race result in the end. For the drivers, I'll start with Magnussen, who had his race come undone pretty early on with some damage and had to stop as he was shown the black and orange flag, so a pretty compromised race for him. Went onto hard tyres, which were pretty useless as we saw up and down the grid, and from there kinda stuck at the back. Also stopped on the second to last lap I think, actually using the VSC, just in case it rained maybe to be on the soft tyres. Got Albon then over the line, but that's still just 16th place. So I think rating wise for Magnussen it's going to be a 5.5, did kind of as much as you could with a compromised strategy, but on the whole seemed fairly average. Then Mick, who actually started well up a few places and while on the mediums, going not too badly. But then Haas put him with the hard tyres, which weren't great, and so lost out some places there before going on the mediums at the end. And he was eventually overtaken at the final corner on the final lap by Zhou as well. Rating wise, probably going to be a 5.5. Like Kevin, just very much sort of seemed to have like an average kind of performance, also not helped by the team too much. Next up Alfa Romeo, and after a promising looking Saturday, didn't really pan out for them come Sunday. I'll start with Valtteri, who was actually going for the one-stop mediums to hards and kind of making it work. He was in P12 before his car did what Alfa Romeo do and died on him in the last couple of laps. But till that point was generally chilling around P12 and didn't really have too much else to do during the race. So rating wise, I think I'm going to go with a 7. Very much what I'd call a solid drive, but definitely nothing too special. Next up, Zhou, who tried to make the one-stop work but ended up having to stop again for an extra set of soft tyres. Until that point had been a fair way back from Valtteri the entire race, but like his teammate was having a fairly quiet one. Did get stuck behind Schumacher a little, which may have then triggered that second stop, but on the whole, I think for a rating it's probably around a 5.5 for him. I think just comparing to Valtteri, a bit slower, not quite making the strategy work as well, and so a slightly lower rating. Next up, AlphaTauri, and still no more points, the car still looking more and more towards a back marker each race. Starting with someone a bit more positive though, and that was Gasly. He started from the pit lane on softs and was up to P12 actually before pitting. Admittedly, other drivers had already stopped, but that's still a good first stint. But then on the second really made progress past Schumacher, Tsunoda, Bottas, and then had final stop for softs. So 2 sets of soft U's, so soft, medium, soft, and then to the flag a fairly chilled race. So for Gasly, I think on the whole it's probably going to be an 8. He ran from the back, managed tyres well, and getting past people, ending up a couple of places off of the points having started from the pit lane. It's a very good drive. And then we get to Yuki, who started P16 and had been caught by Gasly by lap 13 or so, was then brought in quite early for the 2 stops, soft, medium, soft, but after coming out onto the second soft set, he literally on the same lap spun all on his own, flat spots the tyres, has to pit again, race basically over. So for Yuki, it's a fairly bad one. Probably going to have to be a 3. Was definitely slower than Gasly and then makes a mistake on his own that completely ruins an already not great race. Next up, Aston Martin, and actually probably an encouraging race for them, and an extra point helps their total out as well. For drivers, I'll start with Stroll, who had contact on lap 1, fairly lucky not to sustain too much damage. From there, just ran ahead of Vettel with Seb right in behind, and was the same story for the next medium stint until sort of the second half of that stint, where he actually pulled a small gap, and then after the next stops was on softs, managed to go for a move on Ricciardo. Ricciardo then tagged him and he lost his place to Vettel as well. So rating wise for Lance, I think it's probably a 6.5. You know, the pace was alright, on par with Vettel probably over the course of the race, maybe just slightly ahead, and he also would have finished ahead had Ricciardo not hit him. Then Seb, who spent most of the race really close to his teammate, was quicker on the softs to start but didn't quite have the pace on the mediums, and then was a couple of seconds off a Stroll by the time of that Ricciardo collision. So yeah, pace wise, faster on the softs, slightly slower on the mediums, and was helped by a better strategy I think than Stroll, going soft medium medium rather than soft medium soft. I think on the whole, Seb's going to get a 6.5 as well. It's a solid race, maybe slightly behind on raw pace to his teammate, but similar. Also got the point in the end, but Stroll was unlucky not to do so. Next up, Alpine, and double points for them, which is good. Maybe not the best strategy, but they'll still stay ahead of McLaren in 4th place in the Constructors. For drivers, I'll start with Ocon, who lost out to Hamilton at the start and was very aggressive with his defence to Alonso, but all just about fine. Then tried to keep the Red Bulls behind, but in a better car on softer tyres, they were always going to come through. Afterwards, he was with Alonso for most of the race, going mediums to hards, and then the 2 Alpines squabbling, which let Ricciardo through as well. Kept Alonso behind from there till lap 42, and then finished 5 seconds or so behind his teammate. Rating wise, I think it's going to be a 6.5, I think that's probably fair. The strategy wasn't great, but he was definitely slower than Fernando in this one. Then Alonso, who had a very similar race to Ocon really, got passed by Hamilton at the start, did defend well to Perez on lap 1, but eventually got overtaken by the Red Bulls. Lost a place to Ricciardo while fighting Ocon before eventually then passing his teammate and pulling a little gap to him. So compared to Ocon, I think he did well and gets a 7.5, because of both the slightly better pace and eventually finishing higher, with both of them on an equally poor strategy. Next up, McLaren, and at one point had both cars ahead of the Alpines, but in the end come away with the same points total. For drivers, I'll start with Lando, who had a good opening lap. He held off Hamilton and did so for a number of laps before getting past eventually, the softs just losing life, and Verstappen then got through as well. But his battle was with the Alpines, and he kept them a good distance away all race, did have a better strategy, and was clearly best of the rest really. There's not too much to add actually, besides being quite a way up the road from Ricciardo. Overall rating wise, I think it's going to be an 8 for Lando. Yes, a better strategy, but was also 22 seconds up the road from Alonso come the checkered flag. Then Ricciardo, who from the get-go was further back from Norris and behind the Alpines and got jumped by the Red Bulls. Then lost like 6 seconds to Fernando and Ocon, with the softs going off before the team brought him in. When he eventually caught them and passed them later on, he was running a net P8 or so, but then after his second stop had that collision with Stroll, which he got the penalty for and was his fault, and from there his race kind of unravelled into finishing 15th. So rating wise, it's probably a 4.5. You know, he was behind Lando for sure, but still doing alright, reasonably well, but then the collision just drops him down. Next up, Ferrari, and honestly, I have no clue when the next normal race for them will be and if there's ever going to be one. Driver-wise, I'll start with Leclerc, who stayed P3 opening lap, was sort of stuck behind Sainz, asking him to hurry up, did well to overcut Sainz at the stops, which is very tricky to do at Hungary, and then went and chased down Russell, bided his time and made a nice move for the lead. And then Ferrari got involved, stopping him for hards, which we knew would be awful. They should have known the tyres would be useless, and it completely ruined Charles' race, costing him probably a win. But for Leclerc himself, I think rating wise it's probably going to be an 8.5. He did really well to overcut Sainz, clearly had the pace. The reason it's not a 9 or a 9.5 or anything like that is just because the best drivers, even with bad calls, can still find a way to do well. Plus, on the softs at the end, when they did put him on them, he couldn't catch Perez. Then Sainz, who didn't have the most amazing of races. He couldn't quite get the lead on lap 1, couldn't quite get Russell after that, and was slower than Charles. Did have a slower stop, which helped Leclerc to get past him, but then really wasn't on the same level as his teammate. Couldn't pass Russell later on when Leclerc did, and then on the softs at the end couldn't pass Russell again and was actually caught by Hamilton. So on the whole, kinda just a little bit slow, which is a shame as in qualifying he looked really good. Rating wise, I think it's going to be a 6. Very average, I'd have to say. Never looked to be quicker than Leclerc and couldn't make any progress either, but it wasn't like he was atrociously slow or anything. Next up, Mercedes, who after a second double podium have closed the gap to Ferrari to just 30 points. For drivers, I'll start with Hamilton, who had a really great drive. That's also 5 consecutive podiums for him, I believe, in the third fastest car as well. Got a great start past both Alpines and then took a few laps to get Norris, but Lando was on the softs versus Hamilton's mediums. Played the tyre management game on his next stint, closing up to the cars ahead later on, and then in the final stint on the softs was really quite remarkable. Miles quicker than Sainz, who was also on the softs, caught him into P3, then passed Russell up into P2, and I don't think it's out there to say if Hamilton hadn't had the DRS issues in Q3, he for sure had the pace to win, provided Verstappen was still 10th. But rating-wise for Lewis in this one, I think it's a 9.5. From 7th on the grid to P2 in the third fastest car, managing the tyres, making moves when he needed to. A couple of little lock-ups in there, stop it being a 10, plus he wasn't like miles and miles ahead of Russell by the end of it. But I'd go as far as to say that's his best race of the year probably. Next up, Russell, and while P3 on the surface is good, maybe not quite as good as it seems, and I'll explain. So, first stint on the softs, really good, ahead of the Ferraris, and then after the stop stays ahead, puts up a good fight versus Leclerc, but gets past. However, has the pace to keep Sainz behind, does get undercut by Verstappen, but not too much he could have really done there, I don't think. But then you get to the final stint, manages to keep Sainz behind, but not Hamilton, and that for me is where a lot of Russell's rating comes from, which for me is going to be a 7.5. It might be a little bit low considering he's on the podium, but when your teammate comes from P7 and you're on pole and he beats you, it's not great, hence no 8 or 8.5. But on the whole, still a very good drive and still gets a good rating, which is deserved. And then finally Red Bull, who at this point basically have 2 hands on the titles, not sure what's going to stop them. For drivers, I'll start with Perez, who, in all honesty, I felt like was nowhere all race really. Was the slowest of the top 6, I'd probably say. Lost ground to Verstappen in the first stint and then to Hamilton in the second. And had Ferrari not been useless on strategy, then he finishes the race in 6th as well. Also consider with all that Verstappen is 16 seconds up the road by the end of it, winning the race. Admittedly, wasn't helped being pitted into a fair amount of traffic at one point, but still wasn't a great race for him. Rating wise, I think it's kind of like Paul Ricard last week and is going to be a 5. saved from an even lower rating by closing like 5 seconds or so to the cars in front on the last few laps, but still far too little too late. And then finally Verstappen, who wins from P10, helped by Ferrari, but you still have to go out and get it, and he did. Had a good start, jumping a few cars early on lap 1, did well to avoid contact, and then got past both Alpines fairly quickly as well. Closed up to Hamilton and Norris and wasted no time to get past Lando before undercutting Hamilton. From there, ran up to the back of Sainz, and the team once again got the undercut on the cars ahead, past Leclerc as well before his little 360, and then subsequently passed Leclerc again and then pulled away for a comfortable win. Rating wise, it's going to be a 9.5. Started P10 and winning, good start, good overtakes, great pace, and just a 0.5 off for that spin, otherwise it would have been a 10. Which, don't get me wrong, had the potential to be a much bigger impact on the score. Like, imagine if he had to pit again for flat spots, even hits the wall, completely different rating, but he did get away with it and went on to still take the win. So that does round out the race ratings for the Hungarian Grand Prix. On the whole, I think the race was pretty good, sort of a consistent 7 rather than peaks and lows. And for the drivers, a few more not great performances compared to usual, definitely a couple less in the 6 range than I usually give. Then with the updated standings, not much in the first half, but Perez does get a bit closer to Norris, Sainz and Bottas also swap places, then Gasly making some progress up to 12th, and Yuki now down, dropping behind Schumacher. But anyways, that is all for now. As mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more F1 content, along with leaving your thoughts, feedback, ratings and suggestions down in the comments below. But until next time, take care.